This is Polaris-Live. I'm your host, Sarwar KASHMERI, welcoming our viewers from around the world to this global series of conversations on the U.S.-China relationship. This program comes to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I have great pleasure in introducing today Professor Carole MCGRANAHAN from the University of Colorado. Professor Granahan is a cultural anthropologist and historian specializing in contemporary Tibet and the USA. Her research focuses on issues of colonialism and empire, specifically Tibet's imperial and colonial relationship with American, British, and Chinese empires, and on themes of history and memory, power and politics. She's written numerous books and is the author of the well-known Wrested Histories, Tibet and the CIA, and Histories of a Forgotten War. She's also the editor of Imperial Formations, currently working on several projects, including a collaborative project on rethinking the Cold War. As all of you know, we've spent quite a few months, weeks actually, quite a few weeks to explore the relationship between China and US, why it's at daggers drawn, and we thought we'd just try a new tack, bring in somebody that understands history, anthropology, and people. So please welcome Professor McGranahan. Good morning, Professor McGranahan. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. You look like you are in a very rustic house in the mountains, the Rockies. How is it out there today?
That's exactly where I am. I'm 8,000 feet up in the Colorado Rocky Mountains.
Oh my goodness, without an oxygen mask even.
It is true.
Listen, Professor McGranahan, I've been using Polaris-Live to try and understand the real reason for this continuing hostility between China and the US, right? And I was very intrigued with your thesis of arrested histories as you tried to understand all of this in your own work. Is there a way to summarize what your thesis is all about?
Sure, I can explain quickly. So the idea of arrested histories is that at some times, right, certain histories are politically inconvenient to be told. But rather than just being erased or, say, whitewashed, they're instead kind of postponed, right, arrested, if you will, and held until a time in the future comes when it's not just safe, but perhaps even efficacious to tell them. So I argue that in part the Tibetan history of fighting, right, against the PLA to defend the Dalai Lama, to defend Tibetan Buddhism, to defend their families, is a story that's very difficult right now for the Tibetan community to tell. Right, it goes against several other narratives that need to be a priority at the moment.
And so how does this tie into one of your beliefs, which is anthropology, is historical storytelling? How did they come together, right?
Right. Well, so the story never starts, for example, when the anthropologist or the researcher arrives. People sometimes make that mistake, that they think whatever it is they're researching begins when they start their research. But right. Instead, right, I think it's important to ask, how did this, whether it's a belief, a practice, an event, a structure, come to be? Right, well prior, to whenever the research began.
Right.
So it's a situation, right, of asking, how is it? What are the choices Tibetans have made in responding to the People's Republic of China, right? That can't just be an anthropological or even a political question, right? It needs also to be a historical question where you understand, what happened prior to this particular moment, right? Or what are the conditions of possibility for action now?
And of course, you've been looking at empires and how they behave and trying to fit that into your thesis. One doesn't normally think of the United States as an empire, right, Carole? But it is in some ways, right? I mean, there's the Philippines, other issues, but what do you think?
So absolutely. So in 2018, I co-edited a book called Ethnographies of U.S. Empire.
Ah,
And that's a book where each chapter is by a different scholar. And it goes all the way back to the founding, right, of the contemporary United States as a settler colonial nation. So looking at relationships, for example, with the Mohawk Nation, with the Iroquois, with the Osage Nation, but then brings it all the way up to the present, right? So we can say at different points in the history of the United States, right, the U.S. has been actually a variety of different imperial formations, right? So the relationship with, say, the Navajo Nation is not the same as with Hawaii, or as with, for example, the Tibetans with whom I work, right, who have an imperial relationship with the United States, but not a colonial one.
so I'm sorry, who has the imperial relationship?
Tibet. So Tibetans do.
Right, with China?
With both China and the United States, although their relationship with China is also colonial. Their relationship with the United States is not.
Okay, so how about China? How do you view China? Do you use so let me step back. So you actually view America as an empire?
Yes.
Okay. Do you how about China? Do you view China as an empire?
Yes, I do as well. And there are other things, right, that both of these polities are. If we look at, from, say, the mid-20th century forward, following World War II and European decolonization, during the period of the Cold War, right, China, Soviet Union, United States were the great powers, right? But all of them, and so actually including the Soviet Union, were also types of empires at a moment when it was not fashionable, right, to be an empire. And so they mostly rejected that label, and scholars followed suit. So it's really only now, it feels like we're in a second kind of a post-Cold War, maybe not post-9/11 moment, where we're talking more seriously about what would it mean, right, to call China an empire? What would it mean to call the United States an empire? How does that shift our understanding and our analyses?
Well, one of the things you just said I found very interesting, which is that it was convenient for these three to stop thinking of themselves as an empire.
Right.
And academics followed suit. So come on. So you guys gave up your independence? What happened here? I'm trying to understand. Not a glib question.
No, I don't take it that way, even though I'm laughing. Scholarship is situated in the real world, right? And follows trends and doesn't just try to create right thinking, but also is influenced by thinking in the world, and is influenced by the names that polities give themselves, right? So sometimes scholars follow those rather than question them, right? So if a country positions itself as, say, we are a pro-democracy, anti-communist state, or vice versa, right, we are a pro-socialist, anti-capitalist state.
Right.
Then those were the labels, right, that scholars tended to use. In a moment again where both and here I'm referring to, one side we have the communist bloc, one side we have the United States.
Right.
Both of those two possibilities for naming yourself, situating themselves as anti-imperial, right, anti-colonial, which would say like the 1950s, 1960s, it was very important to take an anti-imperial stance, right, at that time.
Right. So let me follow up on that. The question just came to my mind. So the U.S. Uses the term communist government for China.
Right.
It's run by a communist government. The Chinese prefer to call it socialism with the Chinese characteristics. Right. And it's very difficult, I find, to categorize China, right? Because in some ways it is much more capitalist than the United States. I mean, 2/3 of the Chinese GDP now is in private hands. And China mints more billionaires, 3 times as many as America does.
Yeah.
So should we then not use the Chinese definition of who they are, and therefore scholars also should begin using? I'm just trying to, what I'm trying to do in this dialogue is bring a whole separate, different optic to understanding this relationship, and why two sensible, if I may use the word, people are at daggers drawn. So that's my question to you.
Right. So what do we use? China is all of those things. Currently, the current incarnation of the PRC is communist, capitalist, and socialist.
Okay.
I guess what matters to me as a scholar is, what is the context in which we're trying to assess these things, right? At what moment does Chinese capitalism matter? At what moment is it the socialist sort of policies that lead? And what others is it the, more stringent, very disciplinary communist, right, practices? So you and I, sitting, so I'm standing, what you're doing, in the United States having this conversation, kind of our intellectual parsing of these might be very different, for example, than the work that might be done by a Tibetan nomad, right, who, for example, capitalism hasn't perhaps landed in his or her village in the same way, right, as it has for people in Shanghai. I think we can say that, China is all of these things, and that we can say that certain aspects of them are brought forward at different times, but also importantly for different people, right, and for different types of people and classes of people, right, within the PRC. So, capitalism and socialism seem entirely at odds with each other. And yet anyone, who's lived in or traveled to China in the last 30 years, has seen all the many ways, right, in which some people have been able to live this, not without contradiction, but with making contradiction not, a source of everyday angst. And basically that's what culture does for you, right? Culture helps you live with contradiction. Sarwar, are you here? Have we lost you, or have you lost me?
No, now I'm back.
Okay.
Now I'm back. Sorry, I was just going to say, forgive me for calling you Carol, but I hope that's okay.
No, I just referred
to where I'm coming from is China insists that the West does not understand the importance of what they call their century of humiliation. Right? This was a little over 100 years when China was brutalized, colonized, made into, pushed opium into it by the Brits and so on. And they say that without understanding our century of humiliation, you won't be able to understand what our grand strategy is, and you won't be able to understand us. And therefore, this tiff between us will continue moving forward. Does that make any sense to you, that we're not as sensitive as we should be, perhaps, to the century of humiliation? Or does your arrested histories say something about an event that happened 150 years ago, and that it shouldn't really count for that much today? Can you just talk about that?
Yes. So the century of humiliation, is often emerges in public discourse as, you referring perhaps to other governments, have hurt the feelings, right, of the Chinese people. And that this discourse of affect, right, of emotion, is something that's very important in diplomacy, such that there's even a somewhat pithy satire blog that's called Hurt the Feelings, right, that goes through kind of the rhetoric behind this and the strategy behind it. In terms of arrested histories, right, and so thinking about histories that can't be told, right, then there's also the histories that take their place, right? So if you have chosen as a society, or someone in power, right, has chosen that something can't be remembered right now, it must be forgotten, another, right, narrative needs to take the place of that. And the narrative in many ways for China, right, has been this one of emotion, right, that you have hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, that to ask certain questions, whether it's about U.S.-China relations, whether it's about, British or Japanese atrocities in China, whether it's about Tibetan claims on the state now, hurts the feelings. What that does is that shuts down conversation, right? That marks certain topics, right, as not, as not open, right, to be discussed in an intellectual or rigorous sense that acknowledges actually the sentiments of the other, people who are involved in the conversation, right? So it's very much a tactic, that's trying to control, right, what is even on the table for discussion.
Right. And when you use the word tactic, are you also saying that perhaps that's a way of discussing to turn the tables, so to speak, but it may not be necessarily what China believes?
I'm not sure it's a misrepresentation, like deliberate or not. I think it's claiming a position, right? It's just strategically staking out a position of what cannot be discussed through something that's supposed to be inviolable, right? This hurts
Right.
our feelings, and therefore we will not discuss it, right? You have created a wrong against us.
Ah,
And that, that's a very particular way of shutting down a conversation. It actually has some parallels in contemporary political life in the United States right now, right? When conversations around politics are based in group identities, right? So there's a similarity, right? A parallel we could make. But at the state level, at the level of diplomacy, right, it attempts to take topics that should be, that say in the 20th century have been labeled important for diplomacy, right, and state relations. It has taken them off the table and done so through an emotional, language that is not common, right? Nor is it necessarily socialist or communist. I would say here it actually is something that appears to be genuinely, right, Chinese. So there's where that culture comes into the history and politics kind of,
right.
organization of the world.
So is a tactic for discussing with China, could it be something like this, that, hey, listen, we understand the century of humiliation. We understand what you went through. Put that right up front so that that's neutralized, kind of?
That could be one way to try to attempt to, open certain doors for conversation. And I think certain people have tried that before. I know certainly the Tibetans, in their effort to, dialogue with the Chinese, have tried certain things, right? We acknowledge that China has, was victim, for example, during certain parts of, its history. And yet we are now, kind of ironically, now you are the ones victimizing us.
Right.
So that has not been successful for Tibetans. Tibetans, however, as far as China sees it, are not negotiating from a place of equals. Right.
So actually your theoretical work, sorry to interrupt, your theoretical work with Tibet is really transferable, isn't it, to the China-America relationship in many ways?
I mean, in some ways. So Tibetans do consider themselves to be equals, right? That the Tibetans had a sovereign state and continue to maintain that in exile. So they see themselves negotiating with China from that position. Just the same as the United States would. China's view is somewhat different, right? Or even very different, that the Tibetans are maybe once, perhaps, were equals in politics, but are not now. Now, China's relationship with the United States, right, is different. And the United States, even though we have a constant political system, I think we have more variation here in terms of, the parties and who's actually holding office. While there are variations in different regimes in China, there's still much more of a continuity than we see sometimes in the U.S. So I think that opens the door a little bit for China to feel, or Chinese, government officials, when I'm speaking of China as an actor, to feel that there's perhaps less stability in terms of the role of equals.
Right. How do you think the discussion with China would change if America were to now begin with, listen, we understand that we have also colonized, and we understand that we have treated people in a way that perhaps we shouldn't, but we're coming to you now in a different century, and we want to try and make all of this work. I mean, does it help for America to do something like that?
I mean, so the USA could try a strategy like that, right? That we also are, an empire, right? And we have everything ranging from settler colonialism to, overseas, right, imperial relations, such as the ones China currently has in Africa. However, I don't think China's response would be a similar sort of, serious reflection on their history. I studied abroad in Beijing when I was in graduate school, and I remember a young woman saying to me, knowing that I worked with Tibet and that my research was about that, she said, to me, the situation is the same as Hawaii for you, right? She said, how would you feel, right, if Hawaii wanted to be separate from the United States? And she said, you might feel like a part of you was going to be cut off. And I said, well, actually, there is an active separatist movement in Hawaii. And I feel that it's up to the Hawaiians, right, to determine what their sovereign status should be. So it was this very different, right, relationship to territories as part of a national whole, as part of a self. So I think if the U.S. government tried to make an argument such as the one you suggest and say, our relationships with, say, earlier, the Philippines or Samoa, Puerto Rico, again, say the Hopi Nation, are similar to what we see in Hong Kong or, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, just to name a few, right, hotspots. I don't think the Chinese government would react to that, right?
They would not.
In a positive sense. No, that would not engender the the response that you might get right now if the United States, say, opened a conversation with the French government, right, about, responsibilities and obligations, for example, to former colonial territories.
So here's the related question. I just find this discussion fascinating, Carole, I must tell you, because it just goes away from the geopolitical lenses, the power lenses that I've been using with umpteen experts from Asia and America and Europe and so on. But I think this is fascinating because it opens up a whole new way that we might be able to talk about this daggers drawn tiff that we seem to be in with China. But my question is also this: in your work, have you come across an empire that is still not sure of its power, and therefore is very sensitive? I'm thinking now about China. I mean, look at what they've done, right? In the last 30 years, they've taken 900 million people from poverty and raised them beyond that. In 25 years, they've got a high-speed train system that is larger than the rest of the world put together. So, and they're approaching the gross domestic product, the economy the size of America. So one would think that they would be so proud, that they would be so secure. But sometimes I think that they're not. And so, have you come across an empire in your work? Have you come across an empire that, as it grew, was insecure? Or does that even make sense to you that they should be? All the reasons say they shouldn't.
I mean, that does make sense to me. When I look, so my work spans basically the early 20th century to the present day. And again, in relationship to Tibet, British Empire, mostly as based in India, right, China and the USA. If I look at all three of those, and look not just at, say, Whitehall or, DC or Beijing, but look at and it's mostly men, so I will say men on the ground. There are some women too, of course. If you look at the differences in the experiences of imperial officials, say, who were based in Lhasa or based in Kalimpong, or, so, actually interacting, right, with the peoples who are part of this, the imperial, formation, rather than the officials back home, you will see that, the confidence levels, right, the belief in the mission, it varies over time. And that it's not shared by everyone, that there's a lot of political gymnastics as well as emotional gymnastics, right, acrobatics that people do to justify, for example, the constantly claimed either benevolence, right, or need for this mission, right, for these people right here to be part of our polity rather than to have their own.
And I'm going to add something else to your stream of thought, which is the Great Game, right, which was the British Empire and Russia and going through Afghanistan and so on. Had they had instant communication, do you think it would have made a difference? Because a lot of people try to draw parallels between what happened then to now. What do you think?
If they had instant communication,
as in the internet, would that have changed the perspective any?
I mean, some things would have changed for sure. The distances involved at the time, even just going back now 120 years, prevented certain things from being possible that we can do now, including ways of knowing other people, right, and attempting to understand them.
Exactly.
At the same time, here we are now, right, with those technological capabilities, and I'm not sure we've solved that problem.
Absolutely. I was just trying to find an excuse for where we are now. 21st century. Here, the two superpowers, and we're standing there. Now, listen, as we still have 5 minutes to go, and if we run out of time, there are no commercial pressures on us to stop if you're in the middle of something. But I'm coming now to a question with which I've tried to end all of these Polaris-Live conversations, Carole, and which is that, there is so much that America and China can do together, right? We can attack the pandemic, for example. We can get rid of, hunger, things that only large, rich powers can do. So there's nothing that we can do to stop China's rise at this point. We're trying things and they're backfiring, tariffs and so on. So if you were able to find a few minutes in private with President Biden, what advice would you give him from your perspective to try and make it work with China? And obviously one needs two hands to clap, so they would have to, work too. But what advice would you give him?
It's interesting. My mind immediately went back in some ways to Cold War initiatives that were more citizen to citizen, right, on the ground. I think of JFK and kind of the launch of the Peace Corps, right, from stairs of the student union at University of Michigan. And I don't mean we need a Peace Corps, like we don't need to be sending, young Americans to China, but I think civil society initiatives and supporting those would make a huge difference. When I get asked a lot, as a scholar of Tibet, do I see hope? What's in my crystal ball for Tibet? And I always say that, the future of Tibet rests not just on the Tibetan people, but also on the Chinese people. And on Chinese civil society. When I first started teaching here at the University of Colorado, in my classes, I would have a debate on human rights for my students in the Tibet class. And after about 5 years of teaching, I had to stop that debate because the Chinese government shifted its policy on human rights, and they did so in response to their own citizenry. Right, the category of human rights attorney appeared as a possibility for Chinese lawyers, right? Han Chinese, right, trained lawyers working to kind of create new possibilities for defending their fellow citizens, for speaking against the state. And so witnessing things like that, right, witnessing initiatives coming out of China, right, as well as initiatives coming from kind of collaborations as much as possible from Tibetans inside Tibet and outside. I think it's these grassroots, really civil society initiatives where I'm not entirely sure what the program should be, but focus should be, where focus should be placed. High level diplomacy, of course, matters, but when you look at who are the people who in their everyday life, right, are experiencing what it means to be either colonized by a communist country or a citizen of one, those are the folks who are going to have the ideas of what they want that they're not currently getting, and same here. So encouraging that is what I would, or reaching out, kind of those sorts of initiatives are what truly come to mind for me.
And buried in what you've just said, is it also, are you also saying that take a lot of these trade and other issues where we seem to be at blows with one another and maybe put them aside and work on some projects like the ones you've described, so that at least we can start thawing the ice-cold relationship before attacking the issues that really divide us?
I think there could be public, and here I actually want to say overt, because much of the Cold War initiatives, were covert ones, or, CIA fronts. And instead, I mean, things that are not masked, right? So not, say, the Confucius Institutes we have in the United States that, are Chinese government initiatives posing as cultural ones, but instead overt public citizen diplomacy initiatives. Rather than focus on trade will, have us at loggerjams forever, and those can continue. But if we have the work of actual citizens kind of talking together and thinking together, as well as supporting initiatives, in places like China, I think that could truly make a difference.
Have you ever thought of a career in the State Department, advising them what an anthropologist would do? Uh, Professor Granahan, we're running out of time. This is a fascinating conversation. I hope you come back and visit Polaris-Live again at some point. And I really, really want to thank you for being, shall I say, brave enough to come and enter the geopolitical dialogue on US-China. Really, thank you.
It's been my pleasure. No, I think I wish more anthropologists actually were involved in these conversations to just bring in, culture does underlie both history and politics. And so kind of to put these through, to get three together, right? And think them together, not just past tense, but for the
Yes.
future as well. Yeah, thank you.
Again, thank you. Well, with great regret, that's the only amount of time we have. I found this to be a fascinating, fascinating way to understand the US-China tiff. So I want to thank all of our viewers from around the world. Next week on Tuesday, we will have the former Italian official Michele Garaci, who has just made quite a trip to Xinjiang to look at the Uyghur issue, the Muslim Uyghur issue, and take a look at whether it's genocide, not genocide. So that'll be next Tuesday. I hope you'll be able to join us. Please go to my website, which will give you more information on these conversations. And of course, don't forget to register. And until next week, then, goodbye.